Welcome to the book of Revelation. The entire biblical story has led up to this moment. The head of the serpent is going to be crushed, and the world, which is so broken and twisted by the fall, is going to be made new. And we are going to live with God forever and ever. Amen. It's amazing, but Revelation is hard. And Revelation is contentious. And its confusing symbols and its graphic imagery has led to many and divergent interpretive approaches, different lenses through which to view and interpret the symbols of the book of Revelation. And there are three primary ones: a preterist interpretive approach, the futurist, and the idealist. So what are these? Let's try to figure this out. The preterist approach to the book of Revelation sees its visions as all fulfilled in John's own day, in the first century. So it sees something like the mark of the beast in Revelation 13 as pointing to Nero, Emperor Nero, and his reign of terror against the church in the first century. And then it sees the seal judgments and the trumpets and the bowls as God's judgment against Jerusalem in AD 70, when that city and its temple were destroyed. Now, this perspective, the preterist perspective, has the advantage of historically rooting all of the images in events which would have been relevant to the original audience. And its view is that this book is designed to strengthen the church against a rising tide of persecution in the first century. Now, another point in favor of the preterist approach to the book of Revelation are a couple of short time statements. Let me show you what I mean in a chart here. Things that must soon take place. In the very first verse, it says, the revelation of Jesus, which he showed to his servants, the things that must soon take place. So that's chapter 1. Jump down to the last chapter of the book, chapter 22, we see the same thing. These words are trustworthy and true, and Jesus sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. And we also see twice the words of this prophecy indicate things that are near, for the time is near. The time is near, it says again in the last chapter. So that's the preterist approach, seeing the events of Revelation as primarily fulfilled in the first century. On the other hand, the far opposite end of the spectrum is the futurist approach, which doesn't see these events as happening in the first century, but rather as a foretaste and a prophecy of what will take place in the last generation of human history before the second coming. Everything after chapter 2 and 3, the seven churches, all of this refers to the climactic events in the last handful of years before the second coming of Jesus. Now, unlike the preterist approach and the futurist approach, the idealist approach does not look for any single literal reference to the bizarre symbols in this book, but rather sees them as poetic descriptions of the ongoing spiritual struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, which goes on throughout all of church history. So things like wars and rumors of wars, famines, pestilence, earthquakes, these things have happened throughout all of history. It's just kind of normal, a normal day in the life of people living in a fallen world. And of course, Satan, he has always inspired persecution against the church, and he always will. So that describes the life of the first century, and the life of the 15th century, and the life of our own century as well. But the idealist approach says, yes, of course, Jesus will return, crush Satan, vindicate his suffering servants, and fully bring in his kingdom. Now, what perspective are we going to take as we teach through each of these blocks of the book of Revelation? Well, brace yourself. If we're going to answer this question which is critically important because it influences the way that we read and interpret every single verse in this book, if we're going to answer this question, we're going to need to get into the weeds at the very start of our study of Revelation. So in order to answer the question of whether we're going to take a preterist, futurist, or idealist approach, we need to have a firm grasp on two things. One, the date of the book of Revelation. When was this written? And two, its genre. Now, a discussion of the date of the book of Revelation begins with two givens. Given number one, the book of Revelation was written by John. Let me jump into the text of Revelation finally and just to see that. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants, sending an angel to his servant John. And then here in verse 4, John to the seven churches that are in Asia. I, John, your partner in the tribulation and the kingdom. Chapter 22, verse 8, I, John, am the one who heard these things and saw these things. Now, there is general evangelical agreement that the John we're talking about here is the Apostle John, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. So that's given number one. When was Revelation written? Well, it had been written by the Apostle John, so that limits it to the first century, certainly. Given number two, the churches that John wrote to, these seven churches, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, many of these churches were experiencing persecution. And there are two periods during which time the church was experiencing a persecution as described in these churches. Let me show you some of the verses of these churches experiencing persecution. So look with me at the church in Smyrna. Verse 9, it says, I know your tribulation and your poverty. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. This church is going to experience persecution. Same thing with the church in Pergamum. They dwell where Satan's throne is, yet they hold fast to the name of Jesus, didn't deny their faith, even when Antipas, God's faithful witness, was killed. We have a martyr already at the church in Pergamum. And this kind of martyrdom took place under the reign of Nero. This is possible date number one in the late 60s AD, and also during the reign of Domitian. This is the mid-90s. So those are our two options. Late 60s under the reign of Nero, and mid-90s under the reign of Domitian. Now, preterists, to return to our question, preterists, futurists, or idealists, preterists are going to link the judgments, of course, these three cycles of seven judgments with AD 70. They're going to argue that Nero is the one who instigated this persecution against the church as described in chapters 2 and 3. And they're going to base this interpretation on linking a number of details in the text of Revelation to the person of Nero himself. Now, Revelation chapter 17 describes a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, and it interprets these 7 heads as sequential kings. Let me show you. So chapter 17, we have the great prostitute and the beast. And look at verse 9 and 10. The 7 heads, it says, are 7 mountains that are also 7 kings. But these kings aren't existing at the same time, notice, because it says that 5 of them have already fallen. But one exists right now, supposedly, the time that John is writing, and the other is yet to come. And then there's even one after that, an 8th. Now, preterists are going to, let me jump over to a little date about a document about the date of Revelation. They are going to link these 7 heads of this beast to the first 7 emperors of Rome. And it kind of works. Look at this. We have the first 5, John says, have fallen. That is, they have already died. Julius, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, Claudius, they've already died. But one is. They say that's got to be Nero. Nero's the one who's alive at the time that John is writing. The one is. And then it even says that another one is not yet to come, but when he does, he's only going to remain a little while. Well, Galba, he only reigned 7 months. It's perfect. This makes perfect sense of Revelation 17, except Revelation doesn't care about king number 6. King number 6 doesn't matter. King number 8 is the one that matters. The 8th kingdom, which belongs to the 7, that is the one that is the beast. So it's I don't like this interpretation of Revelation 17, 9 to 11. That doesn't quite make sense because Nero, he cannot both be king number 6 and number 8. So that doesn't quite work. And then the mark of the beast, of course, preterists are going to look at this and say, oh, it's Nero. Don't you know that this is Nero, the number 666? Well, that spells out his name, Well, it does, but it requires quite a lot of effort to get there. Let me show you how they attempt this. The preterists who look at the mark of the beast, the number 666, and say that this points to Nero. Well, of course, every letter of a name is added up using the process called gematria, and when you add it up, you get the number of someone's name. But this can only rightly be applied to Nero if first you transliterate his name from the Greek to the Hebrew, and then you have a strange spelling of his name. It's not Nero, it's Neron with an N at the end, and then you have to add the title Caesar. Only after you do all of these things can it possibly add up to 666. So honestly, that seems a little bit forced to me. And then the third piece of evidence that preterists will marshal to say that it was written during the reign of Nero is that the beast, the first beast, he has a mortal wound which is healed. This beast dies and comes back to life, it says. Isn't that bizarre? And preterists are going to point to what is called the Nero redivivis myth and say that clearly is pointing to Nero. Now, what is this myth, this redivivis myth? Well, according to Carson and Moo and many others, there was popular hatred of Nero during this time, of course, and it led to these stories circulating, these rumors after his death and after his suicide in AD 68, that this Nero, he's going to come back to Rome and he's going to lead a Parthian army and all this is going to happen. So preterists would point to this myth that was circulating and say, oh, this is another evidence that we're pointing to Nero. However, this myth scarcely resembles what is described here in Revelation 13. First off, Nero never came back to life. Duh. Secondly, all of the action of these two beasts, really, it takes place after the beast died and came back to life. And all of the persecution of Nero, of course, was before this redivivis myth. So how could it possibly refer to Nero? That doesn't seem to fit. Now, I want to give you a couple of arguments in favor of a Domitian date. And once I do that, then we'll be done with this discussion, I promise you. So the first argument in favor of a mid-90s date is the state of the churches, how these 7 churches are doing. And they're not doing all that well. Let me show you again in a chart. So arguments in favor of a Domitian date. Well, the state of the churches. Look at these churches. The church in Ephesus, it lost its first love. Pergamum, they'd allowed the Nicolaitan error to creep into the church. The church in Thyatira, they tolerated the false teacher Jezebel, who was leading members within that church to commit sexual immorality and offer sacrifices to idols, eat food that was sacrificed idols. And then in Sardis, it's called a dead church. Laodicea is so bad, Jesus wants to spit them out of their mouth. The question is, if most of these churches were only planted in the mid-50s during Paul's third missionary journey, within a 10-year span, how could these churches have fallen so far between the 50s and now the 60s? That doesn't quite make sense, especially look at the church in Laodicea. Now, we know that Paul, when he wrote his letter to Colossians, he said, hey, why don't you go read this letter in Laodicea as well? Look at Colossians 4:16. And there's no hint within this letter that Laodicea is in a bad condition whatsoever. And yet Jesus wants to spit him out. That's kind of a little bit strange. And then to follow our look at the condition of Laodicea, we know that Laodicea was completely wiped out by an earthquake in about the year 60-61. And we have one account that says that it took a full 30 years to rebuild that city. And yet, the letter to the church in Laodicea describes them as rich and prosperous and proud and arrogant. How could they possibly have completely restored the city and their own wealth in just a few years before like the year 68, when preterists claim that this book was written? It makes far more sense that it took 30 years-ish, about the year mid-90s, for that city to be restored and to even call itself wealthy. And then another argument, so this was argument number 1, the state of the churches. Another argument is what's called external evidence, evidence from church history. And pretty much everyone of the earliest church fathers who remotely reflected on the possible date of this book, places it within a Domitian date. All of these guys do. And then notice especially Irenaeus. He's a critical witness who wrote extremely early, 180 AD. He was a resident of Smyrna, one of the 7 churches. He knew Polycarp personally. Who knew John personally? You couldn't ask for a better witness. And Irenaeus said, in his own words, in his work called Against Heresies, John received the revelation in almost our time, he said, toward the end of the reign of Domitian. So that honestly should settle it by itself. And the earliest evidence for a Neronian date, besides a couple of Syriac translations, is this guy Theo Flilac of Bulgaria in the 12th century. Very, very late, obviously. So the Neronian date is almost a modern invention. And therefore, because preterism is a date-dependent interpretive approach, and we have determined that a Neronian date is highly unlikely, we reject preterism and turn now to idealism and futurism, and our discussion of genre, which we will take up in a brief look at Revelation chapter 1 next.